Hi, class. This is Mr. Kinzer, and I'm giving you the literature part 1 tape for lesson 28. And so you can turn to your literature notes and you can put today's date, which is either the 24th of March or the 26th of March, depending on which class that you're in. And this is the literature section. I wanted to tell you a little bit about Ivanhoe and and kind of begin with a review of what we looked at last week. Last week we just had a brief introduction, and we started to see that in the book there's a conflict, and there's a conflict between the Saxons, which are the Anglo-Saxons of England, and these are the Saxons that have been there for centuries, versus the Normans. And the Normans have taken over in England with the invasion of William the Conqueror. So at 1066, as most of you remember, at the Battle of Hastings, the Normans conquer England, and they bring in their French language, French customs. The Normans are from northern France, and they also bring in the many ideas of chivalry. None of those ideas were in England at the time. So chivalry, idea of tournaments, knights, the whole system of the nobility and being loyal to a knight, and the knights being loyal to a lord, and the lord having his king that he's loyal to. And so that whole system is established here with the Normans. And so castles is another thing the Normans bring to England. And of course, the castles were built by the Normans, and they were to tell the Saxons that they were their subjects. And so every time a Saxon would look at a castle, it would be reminded that they had lost their land and that they were in bad shape. Now the Saxons, on the other hand, we talked last week, very freedom-loving, love freedom, independent. Each Saxon was in a tribe, and so the tribes were kind of the predominant structure. They did have a king, but a king was very limited in his power. So, for instance, King Alfred the Great, various kings in English history were limited and always had been. So now the French come in with this idea that the king is unlimited, and the king grants all kinds of boons or rewards. And so this is a direct conflict. So really everything, including their language, they are speaking Anglo-Saxon. And so their language is even different. And so there's a real clash here. And I would say the Saxons hate the Normans and despise the fact that they've lost all their land and everything is owned by the Norman king. The Normans look down on the Saxons. They belittle the Saxons. They are always despised in the eyes of the Normans. And so this comes out in this story. Now, let's go ahead and look at today's lesson, and we'd like to turn to where we left off last week on page 4 and 5, this description of Girth. And so Girth is this swine herder. Pigs were frequently herded and were a great food source for the Saxons. And so we saw these two men. One is Girth, the swineherd. We see them appear on page 4. And his friend Wamba, who is a jester or a harlequin, as we looked at them last week. And both of them were dressed rather differently. Girth was kind of difficult, to really put a real fashion on him, but very poor. They are, we would call serfs. Wamba is a harlequin. He had bright clothing. He was had velvet jacket and crimson cape, and so we kind of showed that he was the jester. So we have this jester and his friend. They're both opening on this scene, and they're commenting on the difference between the Anglo-Saxons and their Normans, who they hate. They're the conquerors. So we see this animosity, this fear and hatred for the Normans as both of them sit talking. So in 4 and 5, we begin to see that. Remember, Wamba's official name is Wamba, the son of Witless. Okay, so his father was apparently witless, meaning he didn't have much sense. And so he is Cedric's jester. So we get the first mention of Cedric, who is a Anglo-Saxon living there in at a place called Rotherwood. So his town or his estate is called Rotherwood. And so now on page 11, they are interrupted and they see a group. This begins chapter 2. So those of you who are not in the Barnes & Noble edition of Ivanhoe, if you look on chapter 2, it starts out with a little quote from Chaucer. And Sir Walter Scott puts these quotes from great works, and he uses that to illustrate this overall idea that he's saying really that a couple things. He's saying that his book, Ivanhoe, is going to rank as one of the great classics because he's using these classics. Here, Chaucer's Canterbury Tales is being used. He's also saying that these same themes that are common in English classics are carried over. And he has these themes, which are the lessons and the storyline carried over in Ivanhoe. So let's read this real quick. It's kind of fun, and it introduces you to some English literature, which kind of sets the stage for what you read when you read Shakespeare or when you read Milton or some of the great works like Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. Well, here's an actual selection from the Canterbury Tales. I think this is one of the tales that has a monk in it, and it is a good description of this monk. A monk there was, a fair for the maestry, an outrider that loved venery, a manly man to be an abbot able, full many a dainty horse had he in stable, and when he rode, men might his bridle hear, jingling in a whistling wind as clear, and eke as loud as doth the chapel bell, there as his lord was the keeper of the cell. So cells were the monks' rooms, and the keeper of the cell is the abbot. So here's this picture of a monk who's riding along, and he has a very dainty horse, and you can hear these jingling bells, or actually as a whistling wind as he's riding, and his abbot is with him. And so there's a little description of these. And so monks and monasteries and abbots, this was a very important part of medieval England. And we see that in Europe as well. But this kind of illustrates that. So we're picking up now with Ivanhoe, and we have this monk who is an abbot from a monastery. That means he's kind of in control. He oversees a monastery. And there's 10 men, as we look on the top of page 11. It says, their numbers mounted to 10 men, of whom 2 who rode foremost seemed to be persons of considerable importance, and the others their attendants. It was not difficult to ascertain the condition and character of one of these personages. He was obviously an ecclesiastic. That means a churchman, like a pastor or a priest. But he was an ecclesiastic of high rank. His dress was that of a Cistercian monk, but composed of materials much finer than those which the rule of that order admitted. So this is an abbot. He's a monk, but he's got very fine clothes, and so this is going to describe him a little bit. His mantle and hood were of the best Flanders cloth. In other words, they were from Flanders. Flanders is over in what is now called Belgium, and fell in ample and not ungraceful folds around a handsome, though somewhat corpulent person. So he's got this beautiful clothing. His clothing belies the fact that he's wealthy, even though he's a monk. And then it says he is corpulent. That's another word for fat. He's very rotund. And so he is not a person who is not eating well. He eats very well. His countenance bore as little as the marks of self-denial as his habit indicated contempt of worldly splendor. So, no self-denial. And so monks deny themselves, they fast, they spend lots of time in prayer, in study, in reflection, meditation. And they're saying here, this guy has no sign of that. He looks like he's not the typical monk. And it goes on and it talks about how he was, pretty well off. And so he's one of these 2 key persons that is riding ahead of the other, of the bunch. Now let's look to the next page, page 12, and let's start a new paragraph. Here's his companion. So we see on page 11 the abbot, and now we're going to see the companion, the guy who's riding with him. The companion of the church dignitary was a man past 40, thin, strong, tall, and muscular, an athletic figure, which long fatigue and constant exercise seemed to have left none on the softer part of his human form. So it's talking about this. The second person is very athletic. He is muscular. It says that he has not had any softness. There's really no softness to his form or to his figure. In fact, it says his form is reduced, having reduced the whole to brawn or muscle, bones, and sinews, which had sustained 1,000 toils and were ready to dare 1,000 more. So the picture we have of him is he's very tough. He's had many toils. He's sustained 1,000 toils, and he's ready for more. So let's put down he's ready for more. And so these would all go in your literature notes section, okay? Now, we also know this is describing these 2 people. So this would really be character. This is external character. If you had to put one of the elements and name the element, this is external. This is what they look like. Now look what it says. His head was covered with a scarlet cap, faced with fur of that kind which the French call mortier, from its resemblance to the shape of an inverted mortar. Now, a mortar is like a big bowl they grind up things in. They kind of smash it with a pestle or a little wooden grinder. His countenance was therefore fully displayed, and its expression was calculated to impress a degree of awe, if not fear, upon strangers. High features, naturally strong and powerfully expressive, had been burnt almost into negro blackness by constant exposure to the tropical sun, and might, in their ordinary state, be said to slumber after the storm of passion had passed away. But the projection of the veins of the forehead, the readiness with which the upper lip and its thick black mustaches quivered upon the slightest emotion, plainly intimated that the tempest might be again easily awakened. So we see that he's been out in the weather. He's been exposed to the sun. And so he is outside a lot. He's a manly type of person. And then it says something about his internal state. Just looking at the outward, he's got veins that stick out on his forehead. And he's got a big mustache that quivers and appears like it's ready to explode. So he looks rather emotional. He looks rather like he could be set off in anger. And so there's kind of a seething anger about this person. And as we look a little bit further, they're on page 13, near the top. It says, the upper dress of his personage resembled that of his companion in shape, being a long monastic mantle. So it's interesting, this guy, even though he's he almost kind of strikes you as a warrior type person, he is wearing something of the monastic order. He's got, he looks a little bit like a monk. He has the mantle. But the color, now we're right on the top of page 13 now, the color being scarlet showed he did not belong to any of the 4 regular orders of monks. So this is a different kind of monk. In fact, it goes into a little more detail as you read, and you can see, though he looks like a monk in part of his dress, he also has a shirt, and he also has a mantle covered with linked mail. So his mantle, this long dress type thing that goes over him, kind of hangs down around his knees. The mantle is of linked mail. So this is chainmail. This is what a knight would wear. So this guy apparently looks like he's half monk, half knight. Now this section of the story continues, and in about middle of page 13, the next paragraph says, he rode not a mule like his companion, but a strong hackney for the road, to save his gallant war horse, which a squire led behind, fully accoutred for battle. So note that he's got a war horse, it's fully ready for battle, and then it says with a chamfron, or a plated headpiece upon his head. So here we have this war horse, and it's fully accoutred for warfare. It has armor, and by the way, the chamfron is like a piece of metal that covers the face of the horse. The eyes, of course, see off to the side, but if you looked at a horse's head, I'm not a very good horse. I'm probably going to end up looking a little bit more like a cow or something here. But the eyes, of course, are to the side, and then the chamfron is like this piece of metal that extends and kind of giving a protection all the way down to the end of the nose. And then, of course, the horse has armor on the rest of it as well. So it might have chainmail. It talks about having a short spike sticking out of the front of this chamfron. So you can see this spike. And I'm kind of moving this around a little bit, but imagine a spike sticking out from the top. And we have this spike that kind of extends. So the horse could lower its head and actually spike somebody with kind of like butting using the face of its head. Notice he has two squires that follow him. Now, a squire is a servant to a knight. It's a knight in training. A squire has to be 15 years old. A knight becomes a knight, and of course all of you know that, having read our book earlier this year on knights. Yeah, a knight is eligible anyway to be trained and to become a knight at 18. So 18 years is sort of the very first opportunity. Now, if you look down toward the bottom of the page, 13, these two squires were followed by two attendants, whose dark visages, white turbans, and the oriental form of their garments showed them to be natives of some distant Eastern country. And there's a note, and these notes in your book, it says, see Negro slaves, note 2. So if you look in the very back of your note, of your book, you can read about how slaves were looked at in those days. Now, what's the situation here? Well, let's look a little bit now more on the character, and if you would turn to character section, we're going to take a quote here. So go ahead and turn to character. Let's enter this quote for character for Prior Eimer, and so that's his name, Prior Eimer. He's the churchman who is this first character. Notice what it says, what he says about Eimer. Quote, he was generous, semicolon, and charity, as it is well known, covereth a multitude of sins. In another sense, ... he frequently relieved the distresses of the oppressed. Period. And so this is on page 15. We see that this generosity, he was generous. We also see that people liked him. He was kind to the poor. So though he personally seems to be dressed very wealthy, he apparently cares for the poor. Another thing that we see here from this quote is that his motive in being generous, his motive was to cover his sins. So in other words, he is sinning in some area, but he covers those sins. He believes that this kindness will help him kind of earn points to cover his own sins. He really desires a good reputation, doesn't he? He wants to have a good reputation among the people, and so he does acts of charity. He also is wealthy. You can tell from his clothing, and very ornamented. Let's go ahead and make a comment how ornamented, perhaps even vain, we might say. He's vain. He shows vanity, meaning he thinks of himself more highly than he should. He's vain. And so the question that hits us is, what do we think of this man as a Christian? So I'd like you to think about that. What is a Christian? And is he a Christian? He certainly is doing some good works. He's generous and kind to the poor. Is he a Christian? He might be. And that's something to weigh carefully, isn't it? So we will find more about him and what Sir Walter Scott teaches about Christianity as we get into the book a little further. We're going to go to part 2 now, and we'll be looking at the second of these important characters.